number 48, with Dr. Warren Farrell. Dr. Warren Farrell is an American educator, activist, and author of 7 books on men's and women's issues such as The Myth of Male Power, Why Men Are the Way They Are, Women Can't Hear What Men Don't Say, and his soon-to-be released book, The Boy Crisis. He is often considered the father of the men's movement, but he started out as a vocal feminist. He came to prominence in the 1970s, championing the cause of second-wave feminism and serving on the New York City board of the National Organization for Women. However, he left NOW and is now recognized as an important figure in the modern men's movement. Thank you, Dr. Farrell, for coming to join us. Well, I'll just say Warren. Thank you, Warren, for coming on. How are you doing?
Absolutely. Absolutely wonderful. It's a real pleasure. I just finished the Boy Crisis book, turned in the manuscript, and so I'm feeling like there's this huge sort of albatross off my shoulder, and this is the first interview I've allowed myself to do, and I'm close to 6 months. So
Wow. And you
very
chose us. Wow.
yes, Allison, I've always enjoyed the way that Allison interviews, and so I wanted to get back in the game.
All
Well,
right.
thank you. That's quite the honor, and hopefully you'll also enjoy the way Brian interviews.
Yes,
He's actually a very good interview as well. But
looking very forward to that, Brian.
he's going to be flying the airplane today
All right.
as the Doge.
But I'm hoping
Okay.
to bring in some genuine conversation, so it won't just be me asking questions. So,
Absolutely.
so we're gonna get right into the topic. This is something that I've actually wanted to talk about on Honey Badger Radio for a very long time, and I think it's very important. A lot of people come across information that they find that other people can use to change their life for the better, like diets or media or social truths. But they can be very hard to introduce into conversation because they can be so stigmatized or because people can be very suspicious of new ideas. We will be examining this today on the show. Talking about the issues facing men amongst people who either already agree or are more or less sympathetic is all well and good. But this conversation has to spread further out and also be challenged more frequently in order to strengthen it. This seems to be the biggest challenge that we have at Honey Badger Radio, as well as within the entire gender discussion. So, since you have a lot of years as a professional speaker and writer, what technique did you find most useful for bringing these kinds of conversations up in your talks to the public or your lectures and so on?
Absolutely. First, on just a purely pragmatic level, I was noticing that when I talked about men, even though I tend to be a sort of very rational person with a moderate type of voice and that people find pretty easy to hear, I think, nevertheless, when I was explaining things from an empathetic to men point of view, I was still getting some like women with arms folded and trying to really hear me. But then if I changed the topic to boys, and then women's arms were unfolding and they were sort of looking at me with some not only empathy about what I was saying, but they were often coming up afterwards and asking more questions to pursue. And so when I started thinking about that, I realized that the first thing that we need to know about men's issues is, let's say, for example, I'm saying something like, when men are when men are involved in a potential sexual relationship with women, we often fear being rejected because the women we reach out to are ones that we know we like, but we're not sure if they like us the same way. And so the adult woman's mind, when I'm talking about an adult man, she's going, I remember times when guys tried to ply me with drinks. I remember times when I said no to guys really clearly, and they sort of tried to sort of wiggle around the nose and not pay attention to the nose. And I felt an experience of sexual harassment or date rape, or there was somebody at the office who was, who I didn't have a single bit of interest in. So I know I wasn't flirting with him, but the blankety blank guy persisted, and he's my boss, or he was my boss's boss. And so I was afraid to say anything. And so she's clicking on all those memories that are male negative when we are talking about adult men. But when I switch to, let's say, when a boy tries to call a woman, he oftentimes fears being rejected by her. She goes, raise our hands. Yes, my son, he says exactly what you're saying. When he tries to call, he really liked this girl named Christina, and he tried to call Chris. He was thinking about calling Christina, but he was crying one day. I said, "What's the matter, Jimmy?" And he goes, "Well, I was trying to call Christina, but I really, I know that she's really much better than I am. She gets better grades, and she's really pretty. And I know she'd have no interest in me. So I know she's just going to say no, or she's going to be really embarrassed, going to put her into a really difficult situation." And mom goes, "Sweetie, you have wonderful sensitivity. You're very bright. Don't ever put yourself down. If you want to be connected with Christina, there are many girls who are sitting around just waiting for a guy to call. And so just, call and at least give her that chance. If the worst comes to worst, you'll make her feel good about herself that she's being sought after." Oh, really? Well, I don't know that I agree with that or believe it, or I still don't know if I have the energy for it. But the point there is that when talking about a boy, the mom suddenly, her heart opens, her eyes dilate differently, her um, her hands uncross, and she is really just receptive. And so, biologically speaking, the most important thing that one needs to know if you're going to speak about boys and men's issues, if you're going to speak about men's issues, understand that you are violating the biological instinct to protect women and the biological instinct for men to be a protector. When a person you want to protect you starts complaining, what you hear as an adult female is whining. And women fall in love with alpha men, not whining men. So so if as Truman says, as Harry Truman said, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen. And
Hmm.
so this is a big one. If you are coming in tension with a biological instinct, you've got to know what you're doing, and you've got to know how to do it. And so this is one of the reasons I enjoy this work, is because um, I feel like I love the challenge of trying to communicate about these issues. When I was talking about women's issues, I was on the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City for a number of years, as I think mentioned in the intro. There was, when I spoke about women's issues, women applauded, and I got standing ovations, and I got 3 or 4 invitations to come back to speak again at different places after each presentation. But as soon as I started understanding what was happening with men by talking about what was coming up in the men's groups that I was forming, um, the response was extremely different. So that's so the easiest way to talk about men's issues is going to boys' issues, where women's heart opens up rather than closes down. So that's the number one thing to understand.
Yeah, that's a good place to start. I mean, women have sons, and that's
Yes,
the part of them that you're tapping into.
and I,
Allison, you were going to say something?
Well, I was going to ask, is there any specific, like you've described how there's an instinct against really wanting to engage with men's vulnerabilities and really be able to just sit with that and just allow the conversation to happen. Has there been any, and one way to go around that is to simply talk about boys who still have that, we still perceive boys as being vulnerable, and women still are open to seeing boys as vulnerable. But just to get into the eye of the storm, just to steer the boat into the eye of the storm, are there any techniques that you found that have been useful to overcome that instinctual aversion to men's vulnerabilities?
yes.
And initially, I want to talk about it in the context of lectures and public speaking. Is there any techniques that you've used in that context to overcome the instinctive aversion?
Yes, yes, absolutely. First, I talk about how much applause there was when I spoke on women's issues, and how challenge. So the framework, the one word framework here is let women know your feelings of vulnerability. So women like it when guys open up and express their feelings. However, they only feel good about that when it's Superman that cries, not not somebody who is weaker. When Clark Kent cries, the woman is turned off. But when Superman cries, she's okay with that. She wants vulnerability within a framework of strength. So first, you sort of share things about that you're doing. Like in my case, I'll talk about my period of time speaking only on behalf of women's issues, and so women see that as strength. This is the type of man they want to see, and then I explain something about how, and this is all accurate, how difficult it was for me to speak up about men's issues more after I found out that I lost my standing ovations by doing that. And so when I lost additional speaking engagements by doing that. So when I say that and share that, and then women's response is, oh, this took some courage. Okay, if other people turned off and when he spoke about these issues, maybe I'll be different and I'll hear him better than other people did. And so whenever we tell a personal story, we share our vulnerabilities, but we're also seen as somebody that basically supports women, and we frame it in terms of how understanding boys and men will help women. Then this is really this moves us in the right direction.
Okay, so what I'm hearing is that you sort of attempt to frame it in a way that you're still allowing for the idea of being that, I guess, Superman character, but you're framing that so that you can get to the description and the explanation of the vulnerabilities that men face.
Yeah.
So it's like a context. You create the context that, yes, you have yourself addressed women's issues in the past, and that you've also overcome obstacles to address men's issues, which sort of establishes yourself as being somebody who's a fighter, who has fought for women and also fights for men. And then in that context, you bring in the description of the vulnerabilities and making those vulnerabilities more accessible, because you have sort of pinned that idea that you're both open to women's vulnerabilities and helping them with them, but also a fighter who's fought for men's vulnerabilities and the recognition of men's vulnerabilities despite the sacrifice that you had to do to go there. That's what I'm hearing. Is that correct in terms of the framing?
That's excellent and outstanding. And by the way, the process that you just used is of saying what I just heard you say is the very key to the process of every bit of communication that one should do with anybody that one talks to. So the first job of anyone that wants to share, especially if you move to men's issues, which I don't recommend, but start with boys' issues. But let's say you move into men's issues because something comes up in the context of conversation that leads you to that. Then your first job is not to talk. Your first job is to listen. And because of the biological instinct to not be able to hear men complaining, this need to listen first is more important than it would be that if you were talking about any other issue. If you're talking about race, standing up for a minority makes you seem good. If you're talking about race and you put down or you make something critical about a minority and you say a minority should take responsibility in some way or whatever, then it makes you seem like a racist. So when you're talking about men, anything that you say that is a support of men, it will only be heard if the person who you're talking to feels heard first. So your first job is to sort of, when an issue comes up, is to say, how do you feel about that issue? And let's say it's fathers being involved with children. And the mother might say, the woman that you're speaking to might say, oh God, I've seen a number of deadbeat dads, and dads, I don't know why they run away from the children. They're not very responsible, and they often lie, and it's all they want is sex, and then they want to get out of the scene. And so you let her know that what you hear that her to say was, just the same type of thing you did with me a moment ago, Allison. What I heard you say was that, and then you repeat some version of that, and then you ask, is there anything I distorted about that? And you give her an opportunity or him an opportunity to say what she or he feels that you distorted. And instead of saying, oh no, I said that, or that's the way I said it, if the person you're listening to feels that you've distorted anything, Your job is to keep working at it until you get an answer from them that says, no, you didn't distort anything. And then your next job is to ask them, is there anything else that you want to add? And so you give them an opportunity not to have to force themselves to get everything that they were thinking about into one sort of rollout, but you give them an opportunity to add more if they want to. And if they do add more, you then say, what I heard you say there was, and then is there anything I distorted about that? And then it's your time to do some speaking. But you've modeled for the person who is listening to you. You've done a number of things. You've modeled for them what you'd like them to do with and for you, and you've relaxed them. They know that they're valued. They know that they're respected. They know that they'll be thought of in a way that that they know that whatever they have to say will soon be heard. So they can not interrupt you, because they know that you're the type of person who's going to hear them out when it's time for them to speak again. And so, and then if they do interrupt you, just say, let me just finish, please. And the second time around, say, can I, I tried to sort of share with you everything I thought you said. Could you do that for me in a polite and respectful way? And that really sets the tone. And that tone is really important no matter where you are. In other words, if this is happening when you're at a dinner table and kids are listening, they're going to pick up far more value from that process being on target, like you just modeled a minute ago, Allison, than they will from the content, because that process is what will carry. I mean, could you imagine if all Trump voters and all Clinton voters listened to each other with that type of respect? We'd be in a world that was, or Palestinians and Israelis, or employers and employees, or parents and children listen to each other with that type of respect. If then our total world would be very different.
Actually, I can add a little bit to that. I don't mean to interrupt you, Brian, if you wanted to.
Nope.
But, in my own experience, I have found that leading with uncertainty is actually a very powerful technique of debate. And I just I often, although in my case sometimes I get a very negative response from it, but I will simply ask somebody to clarify their position, and then just ask again to clarify their position, and ask again to clarify their position. And gradually, if they're really dogmatic, and sometimes they'll get angry at me because I've just proceeded to ask them to clarify their position, and then they start seeing the inconsistencies in their own position, and and they'll say them, they'll ask me, they'll say, you're asking leading questions. And I'll say, no, I actually genuinely want to know what your answer to these questions are. And if you find that they're leading, it's because you're leading yourself somewhere. Mm-hmm. And I found that actually a fairly powerful technique. And it comes across when you describe it as being very conciliatory, very gentle. And in some ways it is very conciliatory and gentle, but there is a power to it. It's sort of like the iron fist and the velvet glove. Mm-hmm. When you lead with your uncertainties and you allow yourself to be uncertain, and just allow the person to tell them who they are. Mm-hmm. In a lot of ways, you are in the position of a dominant position when you lead that way. And you're right, it's a dominant position, but it's a sort of a gentle dominance in my experience. And if the person is at all open to a dialogue, they will regard that kind of gentle dominance, that kind of way of saying, okay, I will let my own needs be secondary to this, and I will hear you, and I'll let you explain your position. If they're at all able to move away from a dogmatic position, they will regard that as being, as you said, they will regard that as being very respectful. Mm-hmm, yeah. But in my opinion, it is also, it's not just respectful, it's also a way of establishing a form of gentle dominance. Mm-hmm. when you allow people to and you listen to what they have to say. You're establishing yourself as being somebody who's in control of their own opinions, mm-hmm. doesn't have to compulsively ejaculate them everywhere, which often sorry. I know I can just hear our audience saying, Allison, you are so full of of caca over this, but it's a debate technique. It's a Socratic method, and it can be and depending on how it's, some aspect of this is there has to be give and take. If you're dealing with someone who is able to question themselves, you might lead them to interesting places by asking them questions. If you're dealing with someone who's very dogmatic, very certain in their attitudes, you may end up getting some pushback from this. However, it's not because of what you've done.
Yes.
You can't, and you have created a situation where if there is any common ground to be had, it will be had.
Yes.
Like, and you are responsible for having created that situation, which is why I call it sort of a gentle dominance, because you are creating a situation. You're the one who's driving it. And like I said, if there's any common ground that is possible to be had, if there's any way that the person that you're talking to can escape their sense of dogmatism, you have created the opportunity for them to do so. And like you said, you've modeled how you want to be heard when you start to speak. Although, as I said, sometimes when I get into the asking questions, I never get to the point of starting to speak, because they answer the questions, and I'm genuinely curious when I ask questions, but they are starting to see how their own belief system is circular and solipsistic, and then they back away and project anger onto me. But what can you do at that point? At some point, being able to talk to people about these things is also being able to know when you have to step away and stop talking to them about them, and when it's not going to be productive. But did you want to add?
Yeah, just one thought on that. I think my desire is not to sort of dominate to be a gentle dominant force, but rather to sort of really to model a genuine curiosity. I do have my own agenda as to where I wish to go, but if I feel like the person I'm speaking with is saying something that's not accurate, I just ask them to. I might say something along the lines of, one of the things when you say a dollar for that men earn $1 for each 79 cents that women earn for the same work. So do you feel that? Do you feel that even when men and women are working at the same job for the same number of years, that they make the same amount? And then she may say, yes, no, they don't. The men earn more than the women do for the same amount. And so then I've set up a sort of like place where, I might even ask for her evidence or his evidence of that, and give them a chance to sort of share their evidence of that. Although I do have in the back of my mind, so maybe it is a gentle dominance, where I want to go with that. Meaning, I'll share something along the lines that, when men and that the pay gap may not be about a gap between men and women, it's actually a gap between dads and moms. And when women have never been married and never had children, they've made 117% more than men have for the last few years. And so I will then contribute something that I know about that in my timing. One of the ways that I prevent myself from being in a speaking situation, from being dominated by the person I'm asking questions of speaking all the time, is to ask that we agree ahead of time, that the moderator agree ahead of time, that both of us be speaking about an equal amount of time. And so that does help that process. And sometimes that is stayed with and sometimes that isn't. I asked for that parameter on an NPR show once, and for the Talk of the Nation. And they agreed that the feminists would speak for the first half hour, and they didn't want a dialogue with me. The feminists didn't, and so the two feminists spoke for the first half hour, and I was scheduled to speak for the second half hour about the pay gap, about a book called Why Men Earn More that I had written, just was coming out at that time. And so the 5 minutes into the interview with me, the moderator sort of interrupted and saying, I'm sorry, we're going to have some questions from the feminists who just spoke. And I said, the producer agreed to this other arrangement. And he said, I'm sorry, the producer would never have agreed to that. And I said, but she did, would you check with her? And so then click, and they hung up on me on the national radio. And apparently, though, they had the greatest number of objections to their hanging up on me that they've had to anything that's ever happened on NPR before. And so people have a sense when they're listening as to the lack of fairness sometimes that that the media, particularly the liberal media, tends to bring to these types of issues.
Yeah, I can't imagine. I would love to have heard some of those complaint letters that no doubt flooded in after that,
Yes.
and what people had to say for that. But yeah, it's when you say that you want to hear the person who's speaking, I think that there's a caveat to that because you should expect the same respect back.
Yes, absolutely. Now, I think for us, for our listening audience, Allison and Brian, I think what would be really helpful is you and I have a chance to speak to audiences, but the average person is mostly going to be dealing with family. And sort of talking about this at Thanksgiving, Christmas, Easter, or whatever, when the family gets together. And one person will be a liberal, another person will be a conservative, one person will have just come back from graduate school where she or he has majored in women's studies, usually a she, and and somebody else will be a Trump supporter. And so everything you say at that dinner table really has to be, you're sort of beginning to fear responses that are negative no matter what you say, being interrupted no matter who you are, and with the larger framework of understanding that a prophet is never a prophet close to home. And so you're always going to be less respected in your family than you will be in a audience where somebody is paying you to speak. At least they've invited you to respect you at the start. And so I think that knowing how to the type of technique that our approach that I was just talking about is especially helpful for people that you sense or know have different perspectives in the world than you do on the political spectrum and on the political correctness spectrum, and especially if you're talking about things like date rape or sexual harassment or domestic violence or abortion. In those four areas, the emotional levels are extremely high. And so the parameters of listening first and showing respect for different perspectives, and hearing each person's story, and even establishing that as what one of the things that you care most about is that we all are able to hear each other no matter what our different perspectives are. And when people say never talk about sex or politics, I say no. Talk about sex, talk about politics, learn from each other, but listen to each other. Don't talk to somebody, because the real job of family is to learn from them. Family often puts us together with other people that we would not normally associate with if they weren't family. The gift of that is the possibility of learning from everybody who you wouldn't normally associate with, as we tend to be attracted more to the people that we agree with.
Wow.
Yeah, I know. Oh, sorry, Brian.
No,
Go
I
ahead.
was just going to say that was actually my next question, was talking about this with friends and family, because we have an audience, and I think that many of them really, really want to share these ideas and have these conversations with people outside of the ones that they already know, that already know about this stuff. And they think that it's extremely powerful and it's extremely important. And, they also are fathers and they're brothers and they have wives and so on. And they want to bring this to the fore. And that was actually my next question. So that was all I wanted to say. You read my mind.
Ah, I'm happy that we're on the same track. Yes, one of the issues that is really important with family is talking about father involvement. The left and the right have different perspectives on that. The left is the right is oftentimes men, fathers should be breadwinners and mothers should be at home. And so when you talk about divorce situations where where you talk about the value of children growing up with equally shared time between mom and dad, that doesn't ring quite true. Are you suggesting, Warren, that the dad should be a sort of like a stay-at-home dad, and for the conservative that sounds like fairy, or or somebody that just can't get his act together, or maybe gay, or what's wrong with you, and aren't you depriving the child of the mother? And from the liberal perspective, fathers could certainly be equally involved with their children if they just wanted to. It's just that when fathers want to be involved with their children, there's a reason for that. And the reason for that is they want to get away with paying child support. And so they're cheap or they're deadbeats. And so where do you go with that? And where you go is that people that you've met who are dads that are different from that. So, in my particular case, I've done a lot of expert witness work with fathers that just are paying lots of money to their lawyers and to people like me for being an expert witness to be involved, to get them more involved with their children. And so, but my research shows that children benefit from an equal amount of time with fathers and mothers after divorce. They benefit from the mother and father living close together after divorce. They benefit from not hearing bad mouthing from mother to father or father to mother.
Mm-hmm.
And they benefit from couples communication without, not just on an emergency basis. And they benefit from equal overnights by both mother and father after divorce. So if you take those 5 parameters, there's nothing that I've said there that favors the father over the mother. But every single bit of that is really documented extremely well. That the children and most people want to know, if there is a divorce, how can we prevent that divorce from ruining the children and hurting the children severely? And so that the adults have the right to divorce if that's what needs be, but they really have responsibilities to take care of their children on these types of 5 levels. And so when you've done your homework and you know the research, and then you talk about a personal story about, one of the people that I met was, remember Uncle Jim? When he got his divorce, I talked to Uncle Jim, and Uncle Jim really wanted to be involved with the children afterwards, but he found that he had to fight for the children, and she sort of acted like she had the right to children, so he took it to court. But the money he spent on lawyers could have been better spent on sending their children to a good, the type of college they wanted to go to, or maybe getting some therapy to have some counseling to help the children cope with the divorce. Because remember Uncle Jim's, Sandy, Uncle Jim's daughter, she went into depression, and the son started acting out in school, and that really wasn't healthy for them. But I know somebody else who had this experience, and that experience turned out much better, and they did have some of those parameters that were stuck together, and instead of fighting it out, they worked it out. And so then people are very easily able to listen to a real life personal experience, especially if it's in the family and other people know that. And when it comes to father's issues, we often we have examples of that in a good percentage of families.
I actually listened. Oops, sorry, Brian. Listening to you, it occurs to me that a lot of. Oh, I think Warren, it's you that you're echoing at the moment.
Oh, Warren, could you mute yourself just while Allison talks? Do you know how to do it?
Yeah.
Oh, no, I don't know how to do it. Let's see.
Oh, wait. Actually, there's no echo now. Allison, talk.
Yeah, the echo's gone away. All right. Maybe it was something. Maybe Brian had some sort of secret influence on that we. It's all your fault, Brian.
He's magical enough to anticipate to have the next question be the thing that I anticipated. So he probably has.
Yeah. Well, what I was going to say is, I was going to point out that anecdotes do really help people to understand the ideas and concepts that you're trying to get across. But I also wanted to point out that I think there is a lot more agreement with the stuff that we have to say than we get a sense from watching the media. Mm-hmm. I think there's a lot more grassroots agreement with the ideas that we talk about. And for me, what's really frustrating is that now I'm dealing with a phone call. Sorry. I'm going to mute. Brian, can you just...
That's okay. You're human.
Oh, God. Okay. Well, let's do this, but while Allison is on the phone. What is a good icebreaker? Is it? Do you think that, let's say you are you just watched one of the Honey Badger shows or a talk by one of yours or Tom Golden or someone else, and you're like, oh man, I want to talk to people about this, or maybe I have a friend who's going through something. Maybe he's going through a really bad divorce, or he's losing his kids, or he was the victim of some wrongful paternity or whatever. What's a way in which people like the people who watch our show, or even some of us, could introduce these topics to people they know? What's a good way to break the ice? Do you have any ideas or thoughts on that?
Yeah, usually when you're in a family mode, if the family is larger, like at a holiday type of thing, or you have a moment or so where people are saying, so how have you been, Brian? And so you use that opportunity to sort of say, yeah, I've been really great. I've been a little bit sad about, John, who's going through a paternity suit, and that's really been kind of sad for me. I've been trying to work with him, but he's really been stressed out. And so then other people are okay about saying, well, how has he been stressed out? And then you tell Joe's story. And then no matter what side of the issue people are on, they're sort of hearing more Joe's story. And there's not a good intellectual argument against somebody who's suffering emotionally. And that is and you can't bring it up sort of like just as proof of, it's more potent to bring it up as something that's affecting you than it is to bring it up as on the issue of paternity leave, or on the issue of paternity fraud, or on the issue of divorce. I want to tell you guys this. If you're bringing it up as an intellectual issue, it'll reach an emotional stop sign a lot more quickly than it will if you're bringing it up as something that's part of the experience that you have in your life that's frustrating you, or that's hamstringing you.
Yeah, that sort of speaks to the million as a statistic thing that goes on with people's attitudes, and that seems to be really prevalent with men too. Mm-hmm. If you talk about men as a group, it's almost like it's almost impossible to generate a sense of sympathy towards men as a group.
Yes.
And there's some etymological reasons for that I don't know if that's the right word, but I've gone through in my own like personal monologues, but I think that there's a very strong tendency to just not want to really get into the word, like the identity man, and really sympathize with it.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I would agree. I would reemphasize that use of anecdotes and use of people that the person that you are talking to knows personally. Mm-hmm. And everybody really does have an uncle or a brother or a father or a male friend who's gone through this kind of thing. It's so prevalent now that almost everybody has an experience of it, yes. Which I think speaks to what I was talking about before, that there is a lot of grassroots support for the stuff that we talk about. Mm-hmm. Sorry, go ahead.
No, you go ahead, Alice.
Well, what I was going to say is there's another aspect to this. Talking to people about these issues, and this is the aspect that I sort of get into personally. There's how to broach them, there's how to make people comfortable with the conversation, and to start with what are your thoughts on this issue, and then listen to them and then repeat what their thoughts are, and ask them to clarify. And so you're bringing up these issues in a way that's not combative, but you're still sort of leading the discussion. But there's an aspect personally that may actually resonate with people who are listening, of why I don't actually talk about these issues. And it's not just to my family and friends. Well, I talk about these issues to my friends because most of them are really heavily involved in this. But why I don't bring this up when, for example, I'm out on the town and with people we're just meeting and acquaintances. And I would have to say that part of it, and like I said, I'm bringing this up because it may resonate with some people in our audience. Part of it is that sometimes being interested in men's issues, and saying that I am a men's rights activist or advocate, it can feel really almost embarrassing and something that I just don't want to talk about. And that I feel like, and I know that this is a very personal issue. I mean, we've talked about how to bring these up, the techniques to bring these up to have a positive outcome. And then we've talked about how we should approach what topics based on who we're talking to. So mothers of sons are going to be much more open to boys' issues, and other people will be much more open to fathers' issues. And so we've discussed some of the strategy, but I think one thing that prevents people from doing it is maybe personal reasons around their feelings around these issues. And like I said, I find sometimes it's extremely difficult for me to talk about them to acquaintances because I feel embarrassed.
Yes, absolutely.
And it would be nice to be able to maybe talk about how to overcome these personal barriers. I know these other barriers are outside of ourselves.
Mm-hmm.
How to break the ice,
mm-hmm.
how to be positive while we do it, how to lead people through this in a positive way so that they respond positively. But how do we break down the barriers inside ourselves talking about these things?
Yes, yeah, really good. The first thing to do about the barrier inside of yourself is to understand that is to give yourself some empathy, because never introduce yourself as a men's rights advocate. That will get you, the stop sign will come up, the emotional stop sign will come up absolutely immediately to anyone who's talking with you. Unless you're talking to Paul Elam or somebody, that's okay. But the reason for that is because the way the feminist movement has framed men's issues is as it being part of the patriarchy. So all civil rights issues until were framed as an oppressor oppressed. And then Marxist type of framing of working class issues were oppressor oppressed. And so the civil rights movement took the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy, which was reasonably accurate in terms of civil rights. There were oppressor slave owners, and there were oppressed slaves, and there was genuinely enormous discrimination against African Americans in this culture, and there is a lot of argument to be made for the way managers were treating their workers prior to the beginning of unions. So that oppressor-oppressed dichotomy makes a lot of sense to people that followed civil rights, or that followed Marxism, or that therefore were involved in the academic community where Marxism was fairly popular. And then, but what the women's movement did is they moved that oppressor-oppressed dichotomy over into saying something like, we live in a patriarchal world in which rules were made by men to benefit men at the expense of women. And so they moved that into the gender issue. And they said we have a world dominated by patriarchy, and what the world was dominated by was not patriarchy, but it was the need to survive. And so when you get somebody who's listening to you at the table, as soon as they mention patriarchy or something along those lines, you say, actually, I think the major need of the past was the need to survive. And our mothers gave up, they risked their lives in childbirth to produce more children who would survive, and then to make those children's lives better than their own lives. And that's what they often sacrificed their lives to do that. And they married men who would often sacrifice their dreams of being a starving artist or writing the best novel for a dream, for something that earned more money in a consistent way, like being a garbage collector, or being working on an oil rig, or working in a coal mine, or doing something. Once men had children, they often gave up the glint in their eye, what they hoped and dreamed to do that would make them stand out in the world, that would be meaningful to them, that would have purpose. They gave that up because oftentimes fulfilling jobs did not pay very well. The art history major graduate did not have as secure of an income as that garbage collector, as a steel worker, as that factory worker. So the man felt he had to work at a factory or do something like pick up that garbage in order to be able, once he had children, in order to be able to earn money that somebody else could spend so that they could live longer, and that often he died sooner. And so that helps people reframe, get off of the patriarchy bandwagon. And what has happened is nobody out there has challenged that as the framework. And so once you're in the patriarchy framework, you see almost all the top executives are male, almost all the top politicians are male, almost all the rule makers are male. So since that has credibility, the average person follows through and says, therefore, the next statement that they must have made rules to benefit men at the expense of women, especially since men get paid more than women do for the same work, all that fits together for them. So you have to take apart first that the survival issue, and then the belief that men get paid more than women do for the same work. And what is, and that's why, and that's a challenging one because, when I'm in a debate or I'm talking to a family member and they say, well, clearly women get paid less than men do for the same work, that takes one sentence and everybody at that family table believes them. Now, for me to respond to that, took me 5 years of writing an entire book, which is longer than I'm allowed at the time at the family table to explain. But there are a few things that I am able to explain at that family table that help people sort of get that it's not just a matter of men earning more for the same work. And one of those things is, that starting out with agreeing with them. It is true that male doctors get paid more than female doctors for the same work. So everybody goes, yeah, you must be on my side. And then I explained, but the difference in pay gap between male and female doctors is much smaller than it is for the average male and the average female. But because you're comparing doctors to doctors, and normally speaking, you're comparing different jobs to each other. So when you hear men earn $1 for each 79 cents that women earn for the same work, you're comparing cardiac surgeons who are more likely to be males to people who are working full-time, that is 35 hours a week or more, as a checkout person in a supermarket who's more likely to be female. And so you're comparing one to the other, which is not a fair comparison. People get that. So then you go on to the next level. However, the male doctor still out earns the female doctor. But then, and you put your fingers up and to show that the difference is not what it was, but still more than. And so you have everyone's attention because you're agreeing with their bias that men earn, that men do seem to be earning more than women, even when their title is the same. But the average male, then you explain that the average male doctor has worked longer number of years than the average female doctor. When you control for that, the gap is less. And that the average male doctor is more likely to be in his own business. The average female doctor is more likely to be in an HMO. And then if you control for own business versus own business and the amount of time that they work, then the gap is very small. But the male doctor still earns more than the average female doctor. And then they're really intrigued. Why would that be? And you say that the average male doctor is more likely to be a cardiac surgeon or a surgeon, and the average female doctor is more likely to be a general practitioner. But when you control for surgeon versus surgeon, equal number of years worked, and equal number of amount of degrees, and both working for themselves or an HMO, then you have the women earning slightly more than the men. Then the question becomes different. Why are the women earning more than men? And then you have a relaxation period of time where you can explain why women who are full-time in the workplace, where all the controls are in place, actually earn slightly more than men. And that was the research I had to do for why men earn more. But those couple of examples and doing your homework about the research just allow you to do that within the framework of keeping your family both interested, fascinated, and either, at least open to hearing it.
It's a good way to, like, a tactic to deal with just relaxing the patriarchy narrative to go through. I might be slightly more combative than you. What I've used is reframing it entirely, because to be honest, even though women earn less than men, they spend at least as much, if not more, or they control more consumer spending. And to be honest, in my opinion, if one group is earning or creating the material goods and the other group is spending it, in no time point throughout history has the group that's been spending but earning less been oppressed.
Mhm.
And if you just apply a little bit of logic to that, you'll identify the types of groups that produce more material goods but do not spend as much as these other groups that seem to be consuming those material goods. And there's a particular word for those groups. But and it's not that I'm saying that I'm going and saying that men are slaves. I'm just saying that, if you're not earning as much but you're spending as much, then it doesn't really so it doesn't really go to say that you're oppressed.
Yes,
Mhm.
exactly.
Because generally the power of money is not in earning it, it's in spending it.
Right.
But that's how I approach that. And the other thing, when people talk about civil rights, and saying that the civil rights, like that the oppression narrative, that does have some applicability when you're talking about civil rights of minorities. And they say, well, the situation between men and women is exactly the same as the situation. You can, what I've done in the past is I point out that the process by which women got the vote was significantly different than any other minority group. Other minority groups had to actually fight in warfare, or had to actually subject themselves to conscription, and were willing to do that before they got the vote. Whereas women, unlike any man throughout all of human history, got the vote without the corresponding expectation of conscription. And so at that moment, that didn't create equality, that created an inequality that favored women. And people will and some people will be open to that reframing, and some people aren't particularly open. But that's how I approach those particular, like the historic patriarchal narrative.
I think they're
Sorry, go
those
ahead.
are really good responses, and very accurate. In the Myth of Male Power, I have a whole section as man as nigger, and it was based on the article in Ms. Magazine called Woman as Nigger. And I just said, it is totally not accurate to call either gender nigger, because aside from it being a terrible word, it is the that to be somebody's, like in James Baldwin's new film I Am Not Your Negro, to be in that position is to be somebody's slave, and to be in a position where you're not making a choice, and that both genders have, based on the need to survive, have both sacrificed in different types of ways. And that if men were making all these rules to benefit men, the first rule that men would be doing is to make a rule where every woman perceived of herself as being more feminine, the more sexual she was with the more men. And that would be a rule that the first rule that men would make to benefit men, whether or not women agreed with it. And the second rule would be that women would, that there would be female-only draft registration, and males would have the option to register for the draft or not. The third rule would be to make sure that women always risked rejection when they were in high school and so on, and feared rejection by the other sex. That it was women's responsibility to risk rejection and men's option to do the risking. And that women would therefore, having risked rejection, they would be willing to pay for all the dates, so that they'd have to work at jobs that they liked less, like mowing lawns or pulling weeds, to pay for those cars that they got to pick up the guys, and so on. And so you just go through a whole series of things, like who pays for the diamond rings. If we made rules to oppress women at the expense of to oppress women, it would be women that would be paying for the diamond rings, and men could just buy a small little gold ring or not. And so there's just thousands of things all around us every day in the society that takes apart, as you were talking about, Allison, the oppressor-oppressed dichotomy. And sometimes you do just have to say those things pretty directly. But the larger empathy I want men to have for each other is, why not say I'm a men's rights advocate right at the outset? Are you afraid to speak for who you are? And the answer to that is to really have in mind what you're up against, and when you're not being heard. It is not you that you should blame when you're not being heard. As I was mentioning at the outset of the show, that that historically speaking, every society that survived based on training its sons to be disposable, in war and to be disposable in work, and therefore indirectly to be disposable as dads. And when you're training somebody to be disposable, a number of things happen. If your son is going to be, you're going to be proud of your son if he goes off to war and wears a uniform. You can't become as emotionally attached to somebody who you might lose as you can be to somebody who you might, who you know will probably be with you forever, like your daughter. Nor can you allow your son to express his feelings as openly as his feelings of pain, his feelings of hurt, his feelings of not being paid attention to, of being sensitive, because you know on some intuitive level that part of what the military will do to him if he goes to war is the first thing that you do in boot camp is to learn that no matter what name you're called, whether you're called some anti-Semitic name or some racial name, that you have to let that go, because your job is not to be seen as a human being. Your job is to be a human doing, to be part of the war machine. And the war machine operates best when no wheel squeaks, when everyone just does as they're told to do, when you give up valuing yourself. And so everything about males growing up and about women's investment and men's investment in survival, if you wanted to survive, you don't turn men into somebody who cares about their feelings, because if they cared about their feelings, we are not saved as a nation by a large number of political liberals who cared about their feelings and got in touch with their feelings and said, I don't really want to go to World War II and fight against Hitler because, I really don't want to be killed, or, I could come back wounded, or I could come back hurt. And so those were things that nobody wanted to hear from men, because their survival was invested in men not connecting to their feelings. And so when you talk about men in combination with that genetic heritage that we are all part of, in combination with the feminist, the feminists putting men as the oppressors and women as the oppressed, that just empathize with yourself, that you can't start out with something that is like saying I'm a men's rights advocate, with something that's basically saying for the average person that they hear is, I am an advocate for the oppressor, or I am a white nationalist, or I am a Ku Klux Klan member. That's not a good starting place.
I can actually I can get in there and say something. The way that the media is talking now, it's actually basically making white nationalists, Ku Klux Klan, anti-Semitic, all of these terms that used to have a valid meaning, it's essentially smearing them over everyone, and also men's rights activists. Like everybody who criticizes feminism now is now a men's rights activist. And interestingly enough, what they'll do is individuals who try to silence there's a huge industry now of anti-feminism on YouTube, like gigantic YouTubers who specifically are anti-feminist, much bigger than us. And what they'll do is they'll say to those anti-feminists, oh, you're just men's rights activists. And then they'll turn around and say to us, like the people who sort of oppose us ideologically, they'll turn around and say to us, oh, you're just anti-feminists. And it's like, well, so they're trying to use both to silence both sides, and it's just really interesting. And what's happening is that the terms are losing their potency. So even if you're a person who are like, you know what, I want to keep the words white nationalists or Stormfront or Ku Klux Klan, I want to keep them actually referring to people who engage in these activities and keep that stigmatized. Please stop using the stigma related to these terms to apply to everybody you don't agree with, because that will make it so that nobody cares anymore.
Absolutely.
About these terms. And that's what's really happening in media, is that they're using these terms so blanket that they're losing all of their meaning.
Yes.
And there's now a sort of a counterculture happening. It's getting larger and larger, that uses the ironic use of these terms and makes fun of it, basically. So,
Yeah.
I mean, if you ever actually look at our chat, you will see a whole bunch of people who are calling or saying, "Yeah, I'm a white nationalist. I'm a racist. I'm all of these things," and they're saying it ironically because they have the media has so diluted the terms and applied them in so many ways. And I wonder if that's eventually going to happen to men's rights advocate or activists too, because they just throw it around in everything. And at some point, the stigma goes away because they're basically calling everybody they disagree with these horrible names, and nobody cares anymore because they've used it too many times and in too many contexts. And essentially, all they're using it for is a way to shut people up that they don't agree with. And I just wanted to point out because there's some interesting stuff happening with labeling and names and groups of people actually using all of these negative terms ironically because they're tired of having it thrown at them as not as an accurate statement of what they believe, but as a way of shutting them up, essentially.
Yes, exactly.
I mean, last night we had a after show chat on a very large YouTuber called PewDiePie has
He's the
been
biggest
labeled
one.
Yeah, he's the biggest YouTuber on YouTube, labeled anti-Semitic
Mhm.
for no reason whatsoever, none, just because people did not like him and they don't like his influence.
Yeah.
So it's a lot of these negative terms. The internet culture is sort of shifting and taking away, I think, the power of these negative terms. So, and the other thing that I wanted to cover with men's rights and what you were saying about how societies up to this point have been successful because they used male expendability. Well, I think the biggest threat to human survival now is male expendability because we can't afford an all-out war. Now we're in a position that if we go there, we're all going to die. Like it's going to be the end of the world. Male expendability makes sense up to the point where you have a species that can kill itself if it gets too pissed off with itself.
Right.
You know.
That's why. Go ahead.
Sorry, go ahead.
No,
I didn't quite hear what you said.
I interrupted you.
Okay. So I think one of the biggest challenges is dealing with the echo. One of the biggest challenges is going forward is going to be sort of detoxing from male expendability itself. Because and maybe I don't know, maybe there are many sentient races out in the cosmos who've had to come to this point, and what brought them to this point, to the point of having the power to destroy themselves, what brought them to the point is something they now have to abandon.
Yes.
Because if they go any further with it, they will destroy themselves. And so did you wanted to say anything to that?
This is why communication is so crucial, because historically speaking, if we didn't communicate very well, if somebody felt criticized and they were in a kinship network or a tribe, the purpose, what they could do to survive was to, as soon as they heard criticism, they thought, oh, possible enemy. So what you do is you get up your defenses to defend against the possible enemy, or you kill the enemy before the enemy kills you. And so not listening to other people's criticisms of you or criticisms of the way you think and believe was functional for survival. However, it no longer is functional for survival when if you have Trump disagreeing with North Korea and they're both going into a bully type of back and forth rather than listening and hearing each other. It could be somebody could be seriously hurt by that. Same with Iran or the Soviet Union or Russia rather. And so there's a need to listen that is more crucial because of not just male expendability, but every gender's both genders' disposability and expendability at this point in time.
Yeah, there's a.
One of the things I want to share there is, so if I were talking, in talking with you, Allison, I think that the most important question to you that people would be, I think, open to hearing without any defensiveness is how did you move? You're a woman. You're obviously not you did not, obviously not grow up with a bunch of sort of reasons to be anti-female. So how did you become, how did you start taking the, how did you evolve from taking the position that you initially would probably normally take as a female to one that would maybe alienate you from females? So when you tell your story, tell us your story that way.
Yeah, like no, and I understand why you're framing it in that way. But the thing is that what moved me wasn't actually any kind of anti-female sentiment. If I were completely transparent, if I look back, it was actually a deep aversion to a certain type of attitude that I saw men having towards women. Um, it was a, I saw it quite a bit with feminist men. It's a condescending attitude that I don't even know if they're completely aware of, but it's a way of erasing women's control over their own lives and their experiences, and reframing women as a consequence to their choices as men. Like that women exist as a consequence and nothing else, not as individuals with their own actions and effects to those actions. And if there was anything that really spurred me towards being really uncomfortable with feminism, it was that.
Mm-hmm.
It was that sort of it was a really icky feeling. Like it was like when, for example, to use an example, I would I write science fiction, and sometimes I write fight scenes, and I would want to talk to a guy, or I knew a man who had experience with martial arts, and I said to him, okay, I'm writing this fight scene, so I'd like to talk to you about how it would play out and how to choreograph it. Mm-hmm. Instead of listening to what I said, he reframed it as me being a victim of an attack by some sort of assailant coming from behind me in an alleyway. And I'm like, I'm not interested in talking about this in terms of self-defense as a victim. I'm interested in talking about this as an author of a, but there was no talking to this guy. So he reframes it all as me being a victim. And that process just felt disgusting.
Yes.
Like it was really and so he's taking away why I even asked him the question in the first place, and reframing it in such a way that he can be the hero of this new scenario that he's put me into. And I felt this continuously with feminist men. Yeah. I would come up to them and discuss a particular topic, and then they would go and they'd take that topic, erase every part of what I was talking about that came from a position where I wasn't a victim. Yeah. I'm talking about this because I want to write a story. No, you're talking about it because you're secretly wanting self-defense information because you're a potential victim of men. And they would they take away all of my personal choice and why I brought up, reframe it as me being the victim of something, and then paint themselves as a hero. Right. And it was just that entire thing. If I'm really honest, it was that gave me the mental energy and the emotional energy to just question all of it. And I get incredible satisfaction. And this is just me personally. I get incredible satisfaction from being able to say, but to these men, look at the situation for men. You don't get to paint me as a victim. I'm not going to be your damsel in your narrative because of this.
Yes.
And that actually gives me great, like on a personal level, I care about men, but it also gives me satisfaction to just stick it back at these guys. And so that's part of why I got to this point. And that's my own personal story, really. So
I think that. Go ahead.
No, go ahead. I'd actually stop because.
I think that's really helpful for men to hear, because that now you're talking about, as I was mentioning a minute ago, the very biological roots of this. We have to realize that that every man wants to be a hero to women. So, and when you get to be a hero? When the woman is in distress. I mean, every heterosexual man, gay men do not have this need to nearly the same degree that heterosexual men do, if at all. And so but when you need to be somebody who is a hero to a woman because she can't do the math problem and you can. She can't change the tire and you can. She can't save herself, and you can. Your underlying dependency is on female dependency. And when women paint themselves as victims and get scholarships or special advantages in the society, as the feminist movement has looked at, has focused on things like there's a microaggression happening against us, or if you say anything that a woman might be, any woman here might be threatened by, you have to give a trigger warning first. These are enormous, institutionalized infantilizations of women that show a complete lack of respect for women being able to defend themselves. And it plays into the need, and it's ironic that feminists have honed victimhood as a fine art, when in fact the ideal, the initiative, the initial aspect of feminism was to make women not to be victims, was to be more in the framework of what you were talking about, of being your own hero. And so feminism has had to try to have it both ways, of making women, applauding women for being strong and being their own person. And that part of feminism I always have and always will support, because I want my own daughters to be strong and independent. And at the same time, feminism, women as victims whenever they wish to be that. And so this is an enormous amount of having it, having your cake and eating it too. And so this clearly must be challenged. Brian, what's your story? How did you get involved with this? Because this is certainly not a position that makes you admired by other women or men. And so it takes courage to do it.
Well, actually, how did I get involved with this? There was a few things. One was I wanted to write I'm working on a series of books, like a graphic novel about my romantic experiences. And I was doing this it started off as a project for one of my art courses. I'm one of those guys that wanted to become an art student and did not realize that this was probably not entirely viable at the time. So I was working on this project, and I made this, essentially I made a comic book, and it was about my life. And what I wanted to do was I wanted to talk about romance from a male perspective. I wanted to actually explore some ideas. I've had lots of long and difficult conversations with friends, both male and female, about this kind of stuff. And I think it's something that most people tend to wrestle with. And I thought, well, let's bring men into the conversation. Usually these things are talked about on the female side. And for some reason, which surprised me, I got a lot of resistance from classmates, from instructors. They wanted me to change things. People were asking me to add elements or include stuff that's outside of the male experience, essentially. And I don't know if it was they were trying to. Some of them thought it was a pragmatic choice to be practical. Maybe you'd sell more issues if you did this. Others looked at it more from a political or politicized perspective, where they said, "Well, if you don't have, the woman's view, then you're gonna. Then there's something that I find problematic about that. Or if you don't have, represent gay relationships or bisexual ones or trans people or whatever, then you're missing out on this and that kind of thing." And I said, but the only experiences that I can draw from, that I can be really honest about, are mine, and mine don't match all that. And so I started to wonder, why is this? Why was I getting so much resistance? And I started talking to one of my friends, and essentially this is how I really got into it. We were talking, and he brought up the grass eaters of Japan, or the herbivore men. And I don't know if you know about that. I'm assuming that you've heard of the herbivore men. And I looked into it, and I thought, this is the strangest thing. These men are just not interested in women. They're not interested in relationships. Now, of course, the herbivore men story is a little bit also about rejecting the social expectations of Japanese men, which is part of where the name comes from. It's intended to shame them, back into the workforce, or providing for women and family, like most Japanese men typically sort of suck it up and do. So
Right.
as I got involved with that, and that just made me more curious, I wanted to understand this more. I thought, well, this is something that I've seen men do, where they kind of select it themselves out of the gene pool because it's not worth the trouble, or they sort of give up. I know people who have done that. So then I found MGTOW, and I started watching a lot of MGTOW content. I started, examining that very closely, and I was actually still having a lot of conflicts. Like I was,
Why don't you explain men going their own way as MGTOW so that somebody that's new to
oh yeah,
this.
MGTOW, or men going their own way. Yeah, men that have basically decided they don't want to get involved with women. They don't want to be made into disposable, financial objects, or whatever you want to call it, because they don't think it's worth it. And as I looked into that more, I found that while I was still a little resistant, like, I guess I see where these guys are coming from, but maybe they're just bitter, or maybe they just had bad experiences. I was trying to remain optimistic. And I just didn't want to believe that this sort of thing should be a necessary decision. And that's when because, YouTube has this thing that it does where it keeps giving you stuff to watch, and inevitably you're going to find your way to Karen. So when I found Karen's videos,
Karen Strong.
yeah, Karen Strong, Girl Writes What, who's one of our badgers, I was hooked. And I have all of these things to thank, to be honest, because knowing and about MGTOW now is actually I actually have a great deal more sympathy towards them than I did when I first found it. It was thanks to some of the sort of evolutionary psychological stuff that Karen was talking about, coupled with the stuff that I found when I found out about what happened with you and the University of Toronto, and I watched all of your appearances on Donahue and these old TV shows. So I knew this conversation has been going on for a long time, and I had not. It was almost like just the wool over my eyes was pulled away, and I saw all of this entire world that I didn't even know existed. And while a lot of people consider this to be, it's almost like there's a burden to it when you learn about all this. You're like, wow, now that I'm faced with this reality, it really is, kind of saddening in many ways. But I find that it's actually quite liberating. Now, I actually understand why things are the way they are. I understand female nature, male nature, in ways that I never thought I would ever understand. And it's actually
Yes.
helped me, overall. So that's basically how I got involved with it, and that's why I actually remain extremely curious and extremely interested in these conversations, which is one of the reasons why I actually wanted to have this topic, because I think the more people talk about it, the more I think that this conversation can evolve and grow, and maybe we can get to the bottom of lots of important questions. I actually am at the point now where I think the relations between men and women is actually probably the most important conversation we can have as human beings. I think it's above politics. I think it's above, the affairs of I don't know, education and the global geo relations and culture and all that. I think that it just seems always to come back to men and women and what we relate to. I think so anyway. So
Yeah, I saw as you were talking, thank you. I thought that was really very clarifying and very helpful. I saw as you were talking, I think Allison put up the interviewee becomes the interviewer. And the reason I became the interviewer for a moment was as part of my role as the interviewee. What I was asking, things I was asking you to do, or asking all of us to do, is to tell our personal stories. And when we tell our personal stories, that is the most effective way of being heard, because everyone is fascinated by, especially a personal story that has a deviation from the norm. that creates a greater amount of fascination. No, very seldom do you go to a movie where the personal story is about the average person's story. We go to the movie to be entertained by and fascinated by different stories that are different from what we normally hear every day, but yet at the same time, this is really a very a story that fascinates us. And I think the best, and one of the reasons why, one of the things that one of the other answers to the question about how do you best approach family is going to become something that will be easier to do in a few weeks. On March 7th, there will be the release of the film called The Red Pill. And The Red Pill is the story of a journalist, a feminist rather, who was a documentary filmmaker who had made a number of films that were extremely sympathetic to the LGBT cause and to other feminist causes. And she came into looking at men's rights advocates as something that was part of the white nationalist group, part of the enemy class, part of the real problem in society. And so with that framework, she entered into interviewing a large number of us in the men's issues movement that's usually called the men's rights activists. And she began to feel her perspective change. But fortunately, what she did was to keep a video journal of how her perspective was changing and the tension she felt and the fears she felt. And I know Cassie J, who was the producer of this film personally, and she lives near me, and we took a number of hikes together in which she at the beginning expressed to me, Warren, I think I'm going to be able to say something that will alienate all the feminists that I have built up as a network over the course of my life. And this is really scaring me because this is both my belief system, these are my friends, these are my colleagues, these are the people who have supported my work, these are the people that have helped finance me. So on 5 levels, I am afraid. And instead of saying, don't worry, Cassie, none of this is going to happen, I'm going to say the only 5 things that you're afraid of are all 5 things that are in fact going to happen. There will be many women, almost every single friend that I had when I was on the board of directors of the National Organization for Women in New York City, whether it was Betty Friedan, Gloria Steinem, and many, many lesser known women, Ivy Botini, Jackie Sabias, they all just sort of deserted me when I began to sort of take a perspective that was not in favor of men get paid more than women do for the same work. Women is oppressed, men is oppressor. And so I said, this will happen. So you have to make a decision. You either have the guts to face it or you don't. But I said, an artist is somebody who paints a picture differently. Do you think Picasso's mother said about Picasso's first painting where the face was turned the other way, oh, sweetheart, that's a very good picture, a portrait of a person. You're doing it exactly right. She probably looked at him aghast and said, my goodness, this is not the way the average person looks at the average body. You cannot consider yourself a good painter this way. So the function of an artist is to get people to see things differently. You can be a coward as an artist and make a lot of money and have a lot of superficial friends who at least have not questioned things like an artist question things, or you can have a much tougher journey and become somebody who says something that is in integrity with what you feel and think. And she, to her great credit, as of March 7th, the types of things that it would take us a long time to explain to our family friends will be available on Netflix and Amazon, called The Red Pill, which is, I think, something that is a very helpful segue from our normal family conversations where we have to do the battle to allowing an extremely appealing, charismatic personality watch her journey from don't want to question it, feminist, to where she goes to in the process of that film.
I just wanted to add something to that because you did use an example that's near and dear to my heart. Because at Honey Badger Radio, we are all artists, basically. It's why if you watch us from the beginning to up to this place, we've gradually gotten better in terms of our production values, because we're all basically a bunch of artists who've been thrown into this because we were attracted to the kind of human truths that are presented in the men's rights movement. But Karen's a writer, Hannah's a fiction writer, she's also a tabletop gamer, Brian's a comic artist, I'm a comic artist and a writer. All of us, and Mike is a drama major, he's a dramatist, and a comedy writer. We are all artists, and we came to this and we developed, I've proposed the platform, and we've all had a hand in developing the platform, and it has increased in its technical abilities because we've had to learn as we go. None of us started out as activists. None of us started out as radio personalities. None of us started out as radio technicians or any of that. We all started as artists who just saw something beautiful in this particular way of looking at the world, something beautiful in the vulnerabilities that men have, and something that we had to express and talk about as artists. Absolutely. And as you were saying, Picasso had to, when he created this new way of looking at the human form, it probably started out, everybody thought it was ugly. And now it's his work is considered to be beautiful and incredibly valuable because he championed it, and his initial fans championed it, and they developed ways of explaining how this is beautiful, the context in which this is beautiful, and why this is beautiful. And I really think that it's going to be artists who come in and look at the things that men's rights activists and advocates talk about and explain to people why they're beautiful.
Yes.
And why they're meaningful and important. And that's really why in a lot of ways, that's why I created Honey Badger Radio. So I just wanted to add to that, and give a little bit of more context. And I know Brian has a few questions or comments he wants to make, but it's well past the hour.
Yeah.
Thank you for staying with us this long.
Thanks for sticking around.
Absolutely. It's always a pleasure to be with you.
All right. Well, I just wanted to go out by saying one more thing. I wanted to say something to the chat. For anybody who watches this video, and those of you guys who are listening right now, you probably have thoughts and ideas about bringing this conversation out, talking to people that maybe you run some kind of a club or little group at your school or your university. I know that there are people who have messaged me personally who have said, I run a youth group and I want to bring this up, but I don't know how to do it. Please share this video if you can. There's a lot of really useful stuff here, and also, even more important, because I am going to look at this and I really am interested to see what you will say, what are some ways that you guys have tried to bring up the topic of men's issues and these sorts of important discussions to your friends, to your family, and maybe even to strangers? I don't know if you shouted at them on the train. Maybe that's not the best tactic, but who knows if it worked, or if you did it in some other way. I want to hear about your ways that you might propose bringing this conversation up. So I really am interested in seeing what the listeners would have to say about that. And that was basically it.
I think one of the really good ways, maybe to close, to explain a good framing for this is I often feel and say that I'm not in favor of a women's movement blaming men, and I'm also not in favor of a men's movement blaming women. I call the movement that I support a gender liberation movement that liberates both sexes from the restrictive roles of the past to more flexible roles for our future. And that's my frame, and that's my goal. I don't want the reason I got involved with the women's movement to begin with is because, like Picasso, it was looking at women's role in a different way, a way that had never been articulated before. But with every virtue taken to its extreme becomes a vice. And when an ideology becomes accepted, it soon builds a bureaucracy around it. And the bureaucracy rigidifies what was previously flexible. And the artist then becomes a bureaucrat. And when that happens, it is our role as artists to begin to get in there and say, we all need to hear each other if we're going to make our roles flexible in the future, rather than who is the biggest oppressor in the future and giving the biggest scholarships to the people who win our hearts as the biggest oppressed groups.
So essentially, our role as artists to poke and poke and poke at all everybody's certainties and make them uncertain again.
Yes, and
Get
yet,
that flexibility.
as artists, not get caught up in our own provocation, to recognize that our long-term goal, that men and women, unlike slaves and slave owners, have this, we're all in the same family boat. And the blessing of the, and it used to be that, women would raise children and men would raise money. So we would both row on the left and right side, let's say, of the family boat. And the women's movement's gift to humanity was teaching women how to both raise children and raise money. The problem is no one has come in there and said the same work needs to be done to make men who want to raise children full time as respectable as women who want to raise money full time. And as a result, if a couple is heterosexual and married, and one of them loses a job, men don't have the flexibility to be respected by women while rowing the family boat from the side of raising children full time, as women have to be respected by raising money full time. And so our goal, being in the same family boat as men and women, are the same. And if we must always keep, whenever either sex wins, both sexes lose if that sex wins alone. And that's the really deeper message that I want to leave us all with, both in explaining this movement to others and also in understanding it ourselves.
All right. Well, thank you for that. And yeah, thanks for coming on. Well, hope to have you on soon. We want to talk about your new book. So if you can come back, that'd be great. All right.
I'd be happy to, Brian and Allison. It's really been a real pleasure.
All right.